Welcome everybody to our group's presentation on the Love Canal ethical engineering disaster. My name is Michael Verveldi, and I'm joined by my group members Nikolai Hinsbo, Nico Jagesberg, and Jacob Smiski. In this presentation, we will first provide you with some background information on this disaster and the decisions leading up to it. Then we will discuss who was affected and how it changed engineering today, before finally wrapping up with its long-term consequences and our group's ultimate conclusions. How would you feel if 1,600 dump trucks of some of the most hazardous chemicals to human life were purposely dumped in your backyard and you couldn't really do anything about it? That's exactly what happened at Love Canal, which is located in Niagara Falls, New York, on the location of a former failed canal attempt to connect the upper and lower Niagara rivers for hydroelectric power. An estimated 21,000 tons of hazardous chemical waste, including benzene, dioxin, and PCBs, were placed into metal barrels, sealed, and placed at the bottom of the canal. The dumping of chemicals happened from the 1920s through 1953 by three main organizations. Beginning in the 1920s, the municipality of Niagara Falls began dumping urban waste into the canal that was collected from the local city. This was a nearby and readily accessible location for the city to dump waste. In the 1940s, the United States Army began dumping waste there as well. This waste was mostly from the World War II effort, which included waste generated from the attempt to build a nuclear bomb. Shortly after, in 1942, the land was purchased by Hooker Chemical and aligned with clay for the purpose of preventing seepage. An estimated 21,000 tons of hazardous chemicals were then placed into the canal and abandoned. This land was then sold to the Niagara School District for $1, in which a school was built on top of this hazardous waste. During the construction of the site, this clay liner was impacted, which created an avenue for seepage to occur. 2 years after building the school above the dump site, a large area crumbled and revealed toxic chemical drums filled with rainwater. Heavy rain events raised the water table within the region and carried these hazardous chemicals throughout the city. This led to complaints from local residents regarding strange odors and substances that would come to the surface in the region, as well as into basements. Severe health problems, including birth defects and a high rate of miscarriages, were also reported. After some investigation by federal government agencies, on August 7, 1978, President Jimmy Carter declared a national state of emergency for Love Canal. Because of its impact and scale, the events that occurred at Love Canal helped lead to the creation of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, often referred to as Superfund.
Thank you, Michael, for addressing the Love Canal issue, everybody. Hi, I'm Nicholas Jagesberg, and I want to start off by talking about the decisions made throughout this process that led to it being such a huge disaster. And it all began in 1920 when Niagara Falls municipality began dumping urban waste into the Love Canal. They knew that this waste would be harmful to the environment and the public health around the dumping, but they ignored that issue because of cost and convenience. And then in the 1940s, the next mistake made was when the military began dumping World War II war effort waste into the canal, including waste that was made from the first atomic bomb. They again knew about the dangers posed of dumping this waste into the canal, but they ignored that issue because of cost and convenience. And then the next mistake made was in 1942 when Hooker Chemical bought the land and began dumping their chemicals into the canal. They didn't install a clay lining around to prevent seepage of the chemicals, but was chemicals as dangerous as the ones they're dumping, such as dioxin, which was one of the most harmful chemicals known to humans. They should know that any damage to this clay lining could be detrimental, which it was. And they dumped there for over 10 years until 1953, when the school board bought the land from Hooker Chemical for only $1. Hooker Chemical told Niagara Falls about the hazardous chemicals that were on this land, but the school board willingly bought the land and built on it, even though they knew it would be harmful to humans, which it was. And even during construction of the school, the next mistake made was there was damage to the clay lining during construction that even damaged some barrels holding toxic waste. Instead of reporting this issue and stopping construction to address it, construction continued, the issue was ignored, which again was another mistake that just chose cost convenience over health and safety that led to disastrous results. And throughout 1955, from when the school was first built, all the way to 1978, throughout the entire time, there were many health reports related to these hazardous chemicals from people living around the area. To the city, Instead of dealing with issues, they either ignored the issues or they sent someone for a quick and easy cleanup that really didn't they just put out small fires about this issue instead of addressing the issue as a whole, which again was a huge disaster that they caused. Every example here is an example of choosing cost and convenience over health and safety of the people affected by this issue. Now, I would like to cover who was affected from this left canal disaster. And obviously, the students and families are greatly affected because they had the exposure to such harsh chemicals. There were reports of burns, birth defects, miscarriages, and even cancers formed from these harsh chemicals. And even the plant life itself was also damaged too. There's many reports of just dead trees and dead grass throughout the area because of the exposure to these chemicals. And as far as the groups go, the local government was very affected because they were one of the main reasons why this disaster happened, as well as Hooker Chemical, obviously, because they were the ones that dumped these harsh chemicals into this love canal. They're greatly affected. And in total, there were over 800 lawsuits filed against the local government and Hooker Chemical for all the mistakes they made throughout this process. And in the end, Hooker Chemical ended up paying huge settlements to the state government and the federal government. They paid $98 million to the state government and $129 million to the federal government to help with the cleanup funds.
All right, thank you, Nico. So as a result of this disaster, many engineering design changes were needed and more oversight was needed on companies working with hazardous waste. So the disaster forced Jimmy Carter to declare a state of emergency, which was the first of its kind for an environmental disaster in America. And it was a big wake-up call to Americans that there were more toxic sites around the nation. This pushed Congress into action to enact more bills to give the EPA more power, which forced companies to comply with environmental regulations. The Clean Water and Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Pesticide Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and the Toxic Substances Control Act are vital to enforcing these new regulations. And what they do is they force companies to abide by different sets and standards in order to help the environment. In this case, the Toxic Substances and Control Act is what was mainly used here. So this forced engineers to come up with new ways to process hazardous waste, store the hazardous waste, and even think about what materials they're using in order to not produce any waste. So what companies are forced to do is that they're forced to use a new multi-step process to dispose of waste. And how that works is that companies are no longer allowed to handle their own waste. Instead, they have to send it to another company who will pick up the waste and then transport it themselves. And this company has to be licensed through the federal government, and they have to be reputable as well. And then this new transportation method also requires new engineering methods. As you can see in the photo, in the presentation of this blue truck here, you can see that this had to be engineered and designed, and this would have only been made within the last 50, 40 years or so. Next, I want to talk about the long-term consequences of the Love Canal disaster. So back in the 1970s and 80s, the EPA moved families outside of the original Love Canal zone, and they set up the landfill site for the canal instead of removing all of the toxic substances. What they did is they covered the area in 3 feet of clay, put a plastic liner over the top, and then added 18 inches of topsoil, where the clay is used to stop the natural elements from affecting the toxic substances and making them rise up out of the ground, while the plastic liner pushes water away from the canal so it can't leak in and infect the rest of the environment. And the topsoil just protects the clay and the plastic liner from the environment. Finally, and then this site also has over 100 chemical monitors to make sure that nothing is leaking out of the site into the residential area around it. And the area where people still live around the containment zone is safe by the EPA. However, Many of the residents in the areas surrounding Love Canal today claim that there is something leaking out of the canal, which is very interesting. One of the main contributors to this idea is that in 2011 there was a lawsuit after filed against the EPA and the government after some waste from Love Canal was found underneath the sewer line outside of the containment zone. The EPA claimed it was an isolated incident and it was cleaned up immediately. But this gets the residents really, really concerned that Love Canal is not being handled properly and that their lives are at stake. And now I'm going to give this off to Nikolai.
Thank you, Jacob, for talking about the engineering design and long-term consequences. Hi, I'm Nikolai Hinsbo, and I'm going to be wrapping up this presentation to talk about who's to blame, our group conclusions, and then a brief summary before we open up for the Q&A. In the case of the Love Canal incident, there are many parties to blame that allowed it to become one of the most appalling environmental tragedies in American history. According to the New York Times, that reported in the lawsuit that followed, the Hooker Company executives were warned for many years by their own analysts about the risks both financially and morally. The Hooker Company claims that they never intended to harm anyone and that the federal government, the state, and the local school board shared responsibility for what happened at the Love Canal. While they are right that they definitely share a responsibility, the Hooker Company is not innocent, and it is apparent so by their own analysts. They used a weak defense in claiming that their disposal did not know about the risks of dumping from scientific information at the time. This is not true, and the Hooker Company therefore definitely shares a large part of the blame in this incident. Other sources, such as the Online Ethics Center for Engineering and Science Organization, believe that it was the government's shoddy handling that ultimately caused the Love Canal disaster. Finally, the school board is definitely to blame because while the Hooker Company wanted to get rid of the land, they were reluctant initially to give it away to a public school. They went as far as to take tests of the land to prove that it was contaminated to dissuade the board from buying the land. However, the board decided to buy the land anyways, and they skimped on construction costs that allowed the toxicity to seep into the building. In the case of the Love Canal, it is such a tragic event with few morally good characters. Our group agrees that practically everyone shares the responsibility for this incident, except perhaps some of the residents that spoke up, and of course the school children. While the Hooker Company, and especially the analysts, do not share a large blame in some sources, our group agrees that they share a large moral accountability because essentially their warnings were just legal loopholes. A lot of this information did not come out until years after in the preceding lawsuits, which shows that they did not care as much morally as they did legally. Even during the cleanup, some of the engineers responsible for the cleanup made questionable decisions, including budget cuts, which just made the incident even worse, even during the cleanup. So overall, our group agrees that there are a lot of people to blame. The Love Canal incident remains one of the largest environmental tragedies in American history to this day. If everyone had followed the engineering code of ethics, this incident should never have happened. There are a lot of consequences that came from the dumping. Firstly, the land is still contaminated to this day, and very few people live in the area. The majority of the residents had their houses bought out by the government to relocate. On a positive side, the incident led to the emergence of an environmental justice movement that lives on to this day, and also the creation of the Superfund. Thank you for listening to our team presentation, and I will now open for the question and answer session.